The knife was still hovering over the roast when he said it. Not even set down. Just paused midair, glinting under the dining room light like it, too, was waiting to see how much damage a single sentence could do. You know, my husband said casually, chewing before he finished the thought. People like you are replaceable. Time did that strange elastic thing it does in moments of real shock. The clink of silverware from the neighboring apartment upstairs stretched into something hollow and far away. Our daughter's glass stopped halfway to her mouth. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the low whistle of the heating vent, my own pulse roaring in my ears. Replaceable. The word landed on the table between the mashed potatoes and the gravy boat like a dropped plate that never shattered, just sat there, daring someone to clean it up. My name is Emily Carter. I was 38 years old that night, a senior compliance manager at a mid-size financial firm, living in a colonial house just outside Hartford, Connecticut. I had been married to Daniel Wright for 17 years, and we had one daughter, Lucy, who had turned 13 2 weeks earlier and still had glitter nail polish chipped at the edges from her birthday party. Daniel didn't look at me when he said it. That was the part that burned the most. He was looking at his phone, thumb scrolling, as if he'd just commented on the weather. As if my entire existence, my years, my labor, my body, my loyalty, was a disposable office supply. I felt something inside me go very still. Lucy's eyes slid from her father to me, wide and searching. In that split second, I knew she understood that something fundamental had cracked. Children always know before adults think they do. They don't have the luxury of denial. Daniel, I said quietly. My voice surprised me. It didn't shake. It didn't rise. It sounded like someone else's. What did you just say? He finally looked up. Annoyed now, like I'd interrupted him. Oh, don't be dramatic. I'm just saying, if you stop doing what you do, someone else could. That's life. Someone else. Replaceable. Life. I watched Lucy's knuckles whiten around her fork. That was when the knife in my hand lowered, slowly, deliberately, until it rested flat against the plate. I didn't trust myself to keep holding it. That dinner didn't end with shouting. That's important. There were no plates thrown, no slammed doors. Just silence. Thick, suffocating silence. The kind that tells you a before has ended and an after has begun. Whether anyone's ready or not. We finished eating like actors who had forgotten why they were on stage, but kept reciting their lines anyway. Daniel talked about a client win. Lucy barely touched her food. I nodded when expected. Smiled when necessary. Filed everything away. Because here's what Daniel never understood about me. I file things away very well. I'd spent years building that skill. Years of listening. Years of being underestimated. Years of making myself smaller so his voice could fill the room. I remembered thinking as I cleared the plates that something in me had finally snapped. Not loudly, but cleanly, like a bone breaking under steady pressure. Later, when Lucy went upstairs, she paused at the landing. She looked down at me, really looked, the way she had when she was little and afraid of thunderstorms. Mom, she asked. I know, I said, before she could finish whatever brave question she was forming. I didn't know how I knew. I just did. She nodded once and went to her room. Daniel didn't notice. He was already opening his laptop at the kitchen counter, tapping away, secure in the assumption that the world, and I, would keep functioning around him as always. That was the moment I realized something else, something sharp and clarifying. He truly believed I was replaceable because he had never bothered to learn what I actually did. I rinsed the plates, my hands steady under the warm water. 17 years of marriage replayed in fragments. The early days when he'd called me brilliant. The promotions I downplayed so he wouldn't feel threatened. The financial systems I quietly organized just to help. The accounts he never checked. The signatures he trusted without reading. That night, when I lay in bed beside him, listening to his breathing even out into sleep, I stared at the ceiling and counted years, numbers, clauses, safeguards. I thought about the way Lucy's eyes had searched mine, not accusing, just needing to know if the ground beneath her feet was still solid. By the time the clock glowed 2:47 a.m., I wasn't crying anymore. I was planning. Because being called replaceable doesn't just wound you. Sometimes if you let it, it wakes you up. And by morning, Daniel Wright was going to learn exactly how irreplaceable my role in his life had been all along. Before that night, before the knife froze in midair and the word replaceable split my marriage cleanly down the middle, my life looked, on paper, remarkably ordinary, respectable, the kind of life people nodded approvingly at during school fundraisers and neighborhood barbecues. I met Daniel when I was 24, fresh out of graduate school, convinced competence could protect me from disappointment. He was charming then, the kind of man who made eye contact like it meant something. We married 3 years later, in early autumn, under maple trees just beginning to turn. I remember thinking I was choosing stability. I didn't yet understand how often stability is just control wearing a friendly face. By the time I was 42, my days were governed by precision. Alarm at 5:45 a.m. Coffee brewed exactly 4 minutes. Commute time to avoid the worst of I-84 traffic. At work, I oversaw regulatory compliance, contracts, audits, risk mitigation. Invisible work. Crucial work. The kind that only gets noticed when something goes catastrophically wrong. Daniel liked to joke at parties that I was basically a professional worrywart. Everyone laughed. I smiled. At home, my contributions blended into the walls. I handled household logistics because I was better at details. Bills, insurance renewals, tax documentation, college savings projections. Those were mine by default. Daniel earned more, at least publicly. He liked that narrative. It gave him something solid to stand on when he needed to feel larger. Lucy arrived when I was 29. I remember holding her in the hospital room, thinking this tiny person had rearranged the architecture of my heart permanently. Daniel was proud, doting for a while. Then life resumed its forward march. And so did his expectations. He traveled more, stayed out later, spoke more often about pressure and responsibility, as if those were burdens he carried alone. I adapted. I always did. I made space. I learned to translate my exhaustion into efficiency. When Daniel forgot Lucy's parent-teacher conference, I covered. When he missed birthdays because of emergencies, I smoothed the disappointment. I told myself this was partnership, compromise, marriage. But looking back now, with the clarity pain eventually grants you, I can see the slow erosion. The way my opinions were first debated, then dismissed, then ignored. The way praise turned conditional. The way affection became transactional, rationed according to how easy I made his life. Still, I stayed. Not out of fear, at least not consciously, but out of habit, out of investment, out of the belief that endurance was a virtue. I thought loving someone meant absorbing their sharp edges until they dulled. The house in Hartford became my project. Daniel signed the mortgage papers without reading the fine print. I read everything. I always had. When refinancing made sense, I handled it. When we set up joint accounts, I organized them for simplicity. He liked simplicity. He liked trusting that things worked without his involvement. It made him feel powerful and unburdened. Lucy grew. 13 came faster than I expected. She started noticing things I had learned to overlook. The way her father interrupted me, the way he took credit for decisions I'd orchestrated. She asked questions. I answered carefully. I didn't want to poison her view of him. I thought protecting her meant protecting the image of our family. That dinner, the one that split everything open, wasn't supposed to be significant. A Tuesday, roast chicken. A bottle of wine Daniel liked because someone important once recommended it. He'd been irritated all evening snapping about a colleague, scrolling through messages as if we were background noise. And then the word, replaceable. What stunned me wasn't just the cruelty. It was the certainty behind it. He truly believed it. Believed I was interchangeable. That my presence was a convenience, not a cornerstone. I realized, sitting there under the soft dining room light, that Daniel's confidence had been built on an assumption that I would always smooth, always support, always stay, that I had no leverage, no spine, no quiet scaffolding holding his world upright. He didn't know the hours I'd spent making sure our finances were insulated against his risk-taking. He didn't know I'd insisted on certain clauses in our prenuptial agreement, just in case. I'd said lightly, back when love still felt like a shield. He didn't know how often I'd chosen foresight over romance, preparation over passion. I had loved him, yes, but I had also protected myself. Not because I planned revenge. Not because I distrusted him entirely. Because somewhere deep inside, a voice had whispered, "One day, you may need to stand alone." That night, after Lucy went upstairs and Daniel disappeared into his laptop glow, I walked through the quiet house and touched the familiar things. The banister worn smooth by years of hands, the framed school photos, the calendar on the fridge with my careful handwriting mapping out our lives. It all looked the same. But it wasn't. I wasn't the woman I'd been when I married him. And neither was he. The difference was I had grown quietly. He had grown careless. As I climbed into bed beside him, listening to his breathing deepen, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not peace. Resolve. The kind that comes when denial finally exhausts itself. Because before that night, my life had been built on accommodation. After it, everything would hinge on acknowledgement, mine first, then his. And the morning was coming. The word didn't fade. Overnight. It echoed. It followed me into the dark, into the shallow pockets of sleep where thoughts repeat themselves like a skipped record. Replaceable. Each time it surfaced, it peeled back. Another layer of illusion I hadn't realized I was still wearing. I woke before dawn, for 12 a.m., the house silent except for the ticking clock on Daniel's side of the bed. He slept on untroubled. One arm flung across the space between us like he still owned it. I stared at the ceiling and replayed the dinner again, but this time in slow motion, examining every inflection. He hadn't been angry. That was the worst part. He'd been dismissive. Certain. As if he were stating a law of nature. People like you are replaceable. Not wives are replaceable. Not partners. People like you. The phrase carried a taxonomy I couldn't unhear. It suggested a hierarchy he'd been sorting me into for years without my consent. I slipped out of bed and padded into the kitchen, barefoot on cold tile. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need to. I knew this space intimately. The drawer that stuck, the cabinet hinge that squeaked, the way the coffee maker needed a firm push to start. Muscle memory from a life of tending. As the coffee brewed, I leaned against the counter and let myself feel it fully for the first time. The anger came first, hot and sharp. Then the grief, heavier. Like something pressing down on my ribs. I thought of the younger version of myself who had believed being indispensable meant being loved. I thought of how carefully I'd arranged my life around his ambitions, his moods, his convenience. And then something else surfaced, quieter but more dangerous. Clarity. Replaceable meant he believed I had no unique value, which meant he believed he held all the power. That assumption was the fulcrum on which everything else rested. And assumptions, I knew from my professional life, were liabilities. I opened my laptop and didn't log into work. I didn't check emails. Instead, I pulled up files I hadn't needed to look at in years. Old agreements. Account summaries. Password-protected folders labeled blandly, invisibly. I reviewed them not with panic, but with the same calm thoroughness I brought to audits. Dates. Names. Authority lines. Daniel had always joked that I was paranoid. He liked to say it with a smile, as if it were affectionate. But paranoia implies irrational fear. What I practiced was risk assessment. There's a difference. As the sky outside lightened from black to gray, I thought about Lucy. About her pause at the top of the stairs. About the way she'd watched me, not him, for cues. Children don't just listen to what you say. They watch what you tolerate. That realization settled heavily in my chest. If I accepted being called replaceable, what lesson would that teach her? That love requires erasure? That respect is optional? That silence is strength? No. I couldn't let that be the inheritance I passed down. Daniel came into the kitchen around 7, tie already loosened, phone in hand. "Morning," he said, as if the previous night hadn't cracked something fundamental between us. Morning. I replied neutral. He poured himself coffee without asking if I wanted more. A small thing. 1,000 small things like that had paved the road to this moment. You seem touchy. Last night, he said, scrolling. I didn't mean to offend you. Offend. As if it were a matter of tone, not substance. I looked at him then, really looked. The man I'd once loved fiercely sat across from me, confident in his place in the world, secure in the belief that it would bend around him. He didn't see a reckoning approaching. He didn't see that his words had detonated something irreversible. I wasn't offended, I said. I was listening. He glanced up, brow furrowing slightly, then shrugged it off. Good. Because you know how things are. Everyone's replaceable in some way. I nodded. Yes, I said softly. Everyone is. The irony didn't register. Not yet. After he left for work, I stood at the window and watched his car pull out of the driveway. 17 years. Condensed into the red glow of brake lights disappearing down the street. I didn't cry. Tears felt like a luxury I couldn't afford yet. Instead, I began making lists. Not of grievances. Of facts. What I controlled. What I had access to. What protections were already in place. What could be activated quietly, legally, cleanly. By mid-morning, the echo of replaceable had changed. It no longer sounded like a verdict. It sounded like a miscalculation. And miscalculations in my line of work get corrected. I thought again of Lucy, of the future she would step into with my example as her map. I thought of the woman I had been before compromise became habit. I felt her stirring, impatient, done waiting. Replaceable had been meant to diminish me. Instead, it had clarified everything I was no longer willing to be. By the time noon sunlight filled the kitchen, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Daniel had underestimated the cost of that word. And he was about to pay it. Lucy didn't say anything that morning before school. She moved through the kitchen with a careful politeness that broke my heart more than any outburst could have. 13 is a strange age old. Enough to sense fault lines. Young enough to still hope adults will seal them before everything collapses. She sat at the island, backpack at her feet, twisting the cap of her water bottle over and over. I poured her cereal. She thanked me. Her voice was steady, but her eyes weren't. Are you and Dad okay? She asked finally, not looking up. There it was. The question Daniel hadn't bothered to ask. The one that mattered. I took a breath. We had a hard moment, I said carefully. Sometimes adults do. She nodded, absorbing that. Then she looked up at me, really looked, and said, he was mean to you. The bluntness of children is a kind of truth serum. I felt my throat tighten. Yes, I said. He was. Lucy swallowed. You didn't do anything wrong. I crossed the kitchen and knelt in front of her, so we were eye level. Thank you for saying that, I told her. That matters. She hesitated, then asked the question beneath the question. Are you mad? I thought about it. Mad wasn't quite right. Hurt, yes. Disappointed. Awake. I'm thinking, I said. And sometimes thinking looks quiet. She seemed to accept that. But as she shouldered her backpack and headed for the door, she paused, hand on the knob. Mom, she said softly. You're not replaceable. The word landed differently this time. Not like a wound, but like a hand reaching for mine in the dark. I know, I said. And I meant it. After she left, the house felt cavernous. I moved through it slowly, noticing details I'd once rushed past. The dent in the wall from when Lucy learned to skateboard in the hallway, the faded family photo where Daniel's arm was draped possessively around my shoulders. I wondered how many times Lucy had seen moments like last night, and filed them away, quietly building her own understanding of love. That afternoon, I picked her up from school. She climbed into the car and immediately began talking about a science project, as if normalcy could be summoned by sheer will. I listened, asked questions, let her set the tone. But when we stopped at a red light, she went quiet. Mom, she said, staring out the window. If someone says that to you again, what will you do? The light turned green. I drove on, heart pounding. Children don't ask hypothetical questions. They test the future. I won't accept it, I said finally. No matter who it is. She nodded once, satisfied, and went back to her story. But I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Because that promise, to her and to myself, had teeth. That evening, Daniel came home late. He kissed Lucy on the head, asked about homework, settled into his routine as if nothing had shifted. But Lucy watched him with a new alertness. The innocence had thinned. She noticed when he interrupted me. She noticed when he spoke over her. And she noticed that I didn't smooth it over anymore. When he corrected me sharply about a minor detail, what time his meeting had ended, I didn't apologize. I didn't laugh it off. I said, "That's not what I said," calmly, and held his gaze. Lucy saw that too. Later, after she'd gone to bed, I stood in her doorway for a long moment, watching her sleep. Her face was still soft, still unguarded. I wondered how many nights she'd lain awake listening to us in the past, counting silences like I had. The thought twisted something deep in my chest. I went downstairs and opened the folder I'd pulled up that morning. I reviewed one document in particular, something I'd insisted on years ago after a conversation with a colleague who'd been blindsided by a divorce. Daniel had teased me for it at the time. "You're planning for the end already?" He'd laughed. No. I'd been planning for dignity. The next few days unfolded with an eerie calm. Daniel didn't apologize. He didn't repeat the word either. He acted as if time would erase it. He underestimated how children remember. Lucy began asking more questions. Not accusatory, just observant. "Why does Dad get to decide that? Why do you do all the paperwork? Why does he get mad when you don't agree?" I answered honestly, age-appropriately, without venom. I refused to lie to preserve an illusion that was already crumbling. And with each conversation, I felt something strengthen between us. A quiet alliance rooted not in rebellion, but in truth. One night, as I tucked her in, she said, "I don't want to marry someone who talks to me like that." I brushed her hair back and kissed her forehead. "You don't have to," I said. "Ever." As I turned out the light, I understood something fundamental. Whatever I chose to do next wouldn't just define my marriage. It would define the blueprint my daughter carried into her future. Daniel had called me replaceable at dinner, but Lucy had already decided otherwise. And that knowledge, hers and mine, changed the balance of power in ways he couldn't yet see. If you'd asked Daniel, he would have said our marriage worked because we played to our strengths. He was the visionary, the risk-taker, the provider. I was the organizer, the stabilizer, the one who kept things running. He said it often, usually with a smile that suggested gratitude, but always with an undertone that placed him at the center of the story. What he never acknowledged was that our strengths had never been equal in value, only in appearance. The ledger had always been unbalanced, not just financially, but emotionally, psychologically. I carried the invisible weight. He carried the credit. It started subtly. Decisions framed as discussions, but concluded unilaterally. Plans announced instead of agreed upon. I learned to recognize the moment his mind closed, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his tone shifted from collaborative to conclusive. When that happened, resistance felt futile, so I redirected my energy into making the outcome survivable. I told myself this was wisdom. I told myself picking battles was maturity. But over time, the battles I didn't pick accumulated interest. Money was the clearest example. Daniel liked to talk about how much he earned. He rarely talked about how much he spent. New gadgets, speculative investments, generous dinners with clients, expenses justified as necessary. I managed the household accounts because it was too boring for him. He trusted me implicitly there. That trust was both a gift and a blind spot. I tracked everything: cash flow, liabilities, projections. When Daniel wanted to take risks, I quietly counterbalanced them, moving funds, shoring up reserves, making sure Lucy's college account stayed insulated. He saw prosperity. I saw exposure. We had a prenup, something Daniel initially resisted until I framed it as mutual protection. He signed it without reading closely. I read it line by line. I insisted on amendments that acknowledged non-monetary contributions, management roles, and contingency clauses. He laughed about it later, calling it my doomsday document. I never corrected him. Emotionally, the imbalance was harder to quantify but just as real. Daniel's mood set. The climate of the house. When he was pleased, everything felt lighter. When he was frustrated, we all adjusted. I became adept at anticipating his reactions, smoothing edges before they cut too deep. Lucy learned it too, though I tried to shield her. Over time, my own needs became background noise. I stopped voicing discomfort unless it was urgent. I reframed disappointment as understanding. I absorbed slights and told myself love required elasticity. But elasticity has limits. Stretch something too far, too often, and it doesn't bounce back. It thins, weakens. The night he called me replaceable wasn't an anomaly. It was a culmination. The final data point that confirmed what I'd been documenting subconsciously for years. He believed the ledger favored him. That his income equaled authority. That my work, both visible and invisible, was auxiliary. That belief allowed him to speak carelessly, to diminish without fear of consequence. What he didn't see was the parallel ledger I'd been maintaining, the one that accounted for power differently. In my professional life, I'd watched executives fall because they misunderstood where control actually resided. They confused title with leverage, volume with substance. They assumed the systems supporting them were static, loyal by default. They forgot that systems are designed, and design implies choice. I had designed much of our life, quietly, thoughtfully, with contingencies. As I sat at the kitchen table one afternoon, reviewing documents while Lucy did homework nearby, I realized something that felt almost absurd in its simplicity. Daniel's confidence depended on my silence, on my continued willingness to prop him up without acknowledgement. The moment that silence broke, the structure would wobble. I wasn't plotting revenge in the cinematic sense. There was no rage-fueled fantasy of destruction. What I felt was a steady, rational determination to rebalance the ledger, to correct a long-standing inequity. Lucy looked up from her math worksheet and frowned. "Why do dads always think they're right?" she asked. I smiled sadly. "Not all dads," I said. "And not always." She considered that, then went back to her work. That evening, Daniel announced a weekend trip with colleagues last minute. He didn't ask. He informed. Old habit. But this time, something shifted inside me. "Okay," I said. "And nothing more." He paused, glancing at me, perhaps expecting pushback or accommodation. When none came, he shrugged and moved on. But the ledger had shifted. I could feel it. Because unequal systems don't collapse from confrontation alone. They collapse when the one doing the sustaining steps back and lets gravity do its work. Daniel had called me replaceable because he'd never bothered to understand the architecture of our life. He'd mistaken my quiet competence for absence. Soon he would learn the difference. The accounts were never meant to be a secret. That's the part that still matters to me. I didn't hide them in the way people imagine when they hear phrases like financial control or hidden leverage. Everything was legal, transparent, signed, documented. The only thing Daniel lacked was curiosity. Early in our marriage, after a small but telling incident where a bill went unpaid because Daniel assumed I'd handle it, I took over financial coordination entirely. Not ownership, coordination. That distinction mattered. At least to me. I consolidated statements, streamlined access, set up redundancies. Daniel liked that he could glance at a dashboard and see everything was fine. He never clicked deeper. Over the years, as my professional responsibilities grew more complex, so did my approach at home. I created layers. Household operating accounts, long-term reserves, education funds, emergency buffers, each with specific permissions, withdrawal thresholds, and triggers. It wasn't paranoia. It was alignment. I aligned our financial life with the reality of Daniel's risk tolerance, which was high, and mine, which was informed. Some accounts required dual authorization for major movements. Others were structured so I could temporarily suspend access without closing them outright. Safeguards I'd learned the hard way at work, applied quietly at home. Daniel knew I managed things. He didn't know how thoroughly. When he teased me about it, I laughed along. You know me, I'd say. I like order. He mistook that for smallness. He thought order meant obedience. The morning after the dinner, after Lucy left for school and the house settled into its daytime hush, I logged into the primary financial portal. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me. What I felt wasn't anger, it was professionalism. The same calm I'd felt during crisis audits, when millions were on the line, and mistakes couldn't be undone. I reviewed balances, timelines, authorizations. Everything was exactly where I'd left it. There was a clause, one Daniel had signed without comment, that allowed a temporary freeze under specific conditions, marital discord coupled with potential financial exposure. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't punitive. It was protective, designed to prevent impulsive decisions during volatile periods. Replaceable people don't think this far ahead, I thought. I didn't activate anything yet. That's important. Power unused is still power, but it must be deployed deliberately. I closed the laptop and went about my day. Laundry, work calls, dinner prep. Life continued, deceptively normal. Daniel returned late again that night, distracted, impatient. He talked about his upcoming trip, about expenses, about a new opportunity that might require moving some funds quickly. He said it casually, expecting assent. I nodded. We'll talk about it, I said. He frowned. What's there to talk about? I met his gaze. The details. He waved a hand dismissively. You worry too much. There it was again. The dismissal. The assumption that concern equaled obstruction. That night, lying awake, I thought about the word replaceable. One last time. I turned it over, examined it, stripped it of its sting. Replaceable implies interchangeability. But systems, well-designed systems, aren't interchangeable. Remove the wrong component, and everything falters. Just before dawn, I made the decision. At 6:03 a.m., while Daniel slept, I logged back in and initiated the protocol. Temporary freezes on discretionary accounts. Spending limits adjusted. Notifications rerouted. Nothing irreversible. Nothing illegal. Just a pause. A breath. A moment where impulse would meet resistance. I finished before the coffee finished brewing. When Daniel woke, he was already late. He rushed through the kitchen, grabbing toast, scrolling through his phone. I'll be back Sunday, he said. Don't wait up. Okay, I replied. He didn't notice my tone. He rarely did. By the time he reached the airport, the first card declined. Not catastrophically. Just enough to confuse. To slow him down. By the time his second card failed, the realization began to dawn. Something fundamental had changed. I was at my desk, reviewing a compliance report, when my phone rang. His name flashed across the screen. I let it ring. Replaceable people react. Irreplaceable systems hold. The first voicemail came through at 6:41 a.m., clipped and irritated. Hey, something weird is going on with my card. Call me. The second arrived 12 minutes later, sharper. Emily. I'm at the airport. None of my cards are working. By the third, his voice had shifted into something brittle. This isn't funny. I didn't listen to the rest right away. I muted the phone and sat back in my chair, staring at the pale rectangle of morning light on the wall. My heart was beating faster now, but not from fear. From the weight of consequence finally stepping into the room. I'd known this night would come someday. Not this exact shape, not this precise trigger. But I'd prepared myself for the moment when preparation stopped being theoretical and became real. That preparation was the reason I could sit there, breathe evenly, and not undo what I'd started out of panic. I went about my day with a strange, floating focus. I answered work emails. I attended a virtual meeting. I nodded at the right moments. But beneath it all, there was a taut string of awareness humming inside me. This was the longest night of my life stretched into daylight. By noon, the calls escalated. Missed call after missed call. Text messages stacking up. What did you do? This better be a mistake. I'm stuck. I imagined him standing at the rental car counter, suit jacket slung over his arm, confidence cracking as each attempt failed. I imagined the creeping embarrassment, the dawning realization that the systems he'd trusted blindly no longer bent at his command. When I finally answered, I did it from the quiet of the car, parked a block away from Lucy's school. "Emily," he said immediately, skipping any pretense. "My accounts are frozen." "Yes," I said. A pause. A recalibration. "Why?" "Because we're in a volatile period," I replied evenly. "And that's exactly what the safeguards are for." "What safeguards?" His voice rose. "This is ridiculous. Fix it." I closed my eyes briefly. "We'll talk tonight." "I have meetings," he snapped. "I need access." "You should have read the agreements," I said softly. The line went silent for a moment. Then, "You did this on purpose." I thought of Lucy's face, of the word replaceable, of 17 years of quiet labor. "I did this responsibly," I said. "There's a difference." He hung up. That afternoon dragged. Every minute felt charged, electric. I picked Lucy up from school and forced myself to stay present, to ask about her day, to listen as she talked about a friend. Drama that suddenly seemed both trivial and precious. The world keeps turning, even when your personal axis shifts. At home, I cooked dinner. Not out of obligation, but out of routine. The familiar motions grounded me. Chop, stir, simmer, control where I could find it. Daniel came home early, face tight with restrained fury. Lucy sensed it immediately. She retreated upstairs. Without being asked. The house held its breath. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, pacing the kitchen. I leaned against the counter. "We need to talk." "You've humiliated me," he said. "Do you have any idea?" "Sit down." I interrupted. He froze. I had never interrupted him like that before. Slowly he sat. I explained calmly, methodically. The clauses. The triggers. The temporary nature of the freeze. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't apologize. I spoke the way I did at work when stakes were high and emotions were noise. "You can't do this," he said finally. "I already did," I replied. "You're overreacting to a comment." I met his eyes. Words have consequences. Silence filled the space between us, thick and unavoidable. For the first time, I saw something like uncertainty flicker across his face. Not remorse. Calculation. He was reassessing the terrain. "This hurts Lucy," he said, grasping for leverage. I shook my head. "What hurts Lucy is watching her mother be diminished." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. That night, after he retreated to the guest room, I lay awake listening to the house settle. The longest night wasn't about fear of him. It was about mourning the illusion I'd carried for years, that endurance was the same as love, that silence was the same as peace. By morning, that illusion would be gone entirely, and in its place would be something harder, something truer. Morning came without mercy. Pale, indifferent light crept through the blinds as if nothing monumental had happened, as if the world hadn't quietly tipped on its axis overnight. I'd slept less than an hour, my mind running scenarios with the precision of a courtroom cross-examination. By the time my alarm went off at 5:45, I was already sitting upright, fully awake, calm in a way that felt almost unnatural. Daniel didn't emerge from the guest room. I heard the shower running, the muffled thud of cabinet doors. He was avoiding me, recalibrating. That told me more than any apology could have. I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, sunlight just beginning to touch the edges of the room. This was the moment I'd been circling since the knife froze midair at dinner. The point of no return. Once certain actions are taken, they change the shape of everything that follows. At 6:18 a.m., I initiated the next step. This one wasn't financial. It was procedural. I sent a single email, from my personal account, not my work one, to an attorney I'd met years earlier through a compliance conference. She specialized in marital asset protection and family law, the kind of lawyer people think they don't need until suddenly they do. I kept it brief. Factual. Noi moustin. I need to formalize protections already in place. Time sensitive. She responded within 9 minutes. By the time Lucy came downstairs, dressed and quiet, the gears were already turning. I smiled at her, poured her juice, asked about her science quiz. Normalcy again, carefully constructed. She watched me closely though. Children always do when something big is happening. Is Dad mad? She asked. Yes, I said honestly. But that's not your responsibility. She nodded, relief flickering across her face. Daniel left without speaking to either of us. The front door closed with a finality that echoed through the house. I didn't chase him. I didn't text. I let the silence stand. A boundary he'd have to decide whether to cross with humility or hostility. Once Lucy was at school, I sat down again and reviewed everything with ruthless clarity. This wasn't about punishment. It was about control of the narrative, legal, financial, emotional. I documented timelines, saved messages, logged incidents. Not because I enjoyed it, but because memory alone is fragile, and facts endure. At 9:42 a.m., Daniel called again. You need to reverse this, he said, skipping greetings. No, irreplaceable. This is insane, he snapped. You're acting like I did something unforgivable. I thought of Lucy's voice saying you're not replaceable. I thought of the years I'd swallowed my own discomfort to keep the peace. You did, I said quietly. He laughed then, a sharp, disbelieving sound. You're going to blow up our family over one word? No, I said. I'm refusing to disappear over it. That stopped him. We talked for 20 minutes. Not arguing, circling. He tried minimization. He tried guilt. He tried authority. None of it landed. I stayed steady, anchored to the same point. Respect isn't negotiable, and access isn't automatic. When the call ended, my hands were trembling slightly. I let them. Strength doesn't mean numbness. It means acting anyway. By late morning, the reality of the freeze had spread into other areas of his life. Travel complications, awkward conversations. The smooth machinery he'd relied on was stuttering. Each interruption was a message. Systems don't run on entitlement alone. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt resolved. That afternoon, my attorney called. We spoke in precise language, outlining next steps, contingencies, documentation. She didn't ask me how I felt. She asked me what outcome I wanted. I knew the answer immediately. I want my daughter to grow up knowing that words matter, I said. And that silence isn't safety. When Lucy came home, she was quieter than usual. She hovered near me as I cooked dinner, pretending to do homework at the counter. Did something bad happen today? She asked. Something important did, I said. And important things can feel bad at first. She considered that, then nodded. That night, as I lay in bed alone, the house finally still, I felt the weight of the morning settle into my bones. Clarity has a cost. Once you see things as they are, you can't unsee them. You can't go back to comfort built on erasure. By morning, Daniel's accounts were frozen. But more importantly, so was the version of me who had ever believed she was replaceable. When his cards declined in front of other people, that's when it stopped being theoretical for Daniel. That's when the problem ceased to be between us and became, in his mind, a public malfunction that demanded immediate correction. He didn't tell me the details at first. He never does when he's embarrassed. But they leaked out anyway in sharp fragments over the course of that day. The rental car counter. The awkward pause while the agent tried again. The quiet cough from the man behind him in line. The forced laugh Daniel used when he wanted to pretend something wasn't happening. The moment the agent said, "Sir, I'll need another form of payment." There wasn't one. By mid-afternoon, the text shifted tone completely. This is serious. People are noticing. You're making me look incompetent. That last one almost made me smile. Not because I wanted him humiliated, but because finally he understood something essential. Reputation is currency. And his was no longer entirely under his control. He came home early again, face flushed, movements sharp. He didn't pace this time. He stood very still, like someone afraid that if they moved too much, everything might collapse. "Do you have any idea what today was like?" he he asked. Yes, I said. And I did. I could picture it with unnerving accuracy. I had to call my assistant, he continued, voice tight. I had to explain. I raised my hand gently. You didn't have to explain anything. You chose to. He stared at me. You're enjoying this? No, I said immediately. I'm enduring it. There's a difference. Enjoyment implies pleasure. This was something else, something closer to necessity. He ran a hand through his hair. Fix it. Today. I shook my head. Not yet. Why? His voice cracked on the word. I took a breath. Because we're not done talking. And because access without accountability is how we got here. The words landed harder than I expected. He flinched. That surprised me. For the first time since dinner, I saw something like fear flicker beneath his anger. Not fear of me, but fear of instability, of unpredictability, of being unmoored from the systems that had always affirmed his importance. You can't just pull the plug, he said. This is my life. I met his gaze. It's our life. Or it was. That night, Lucy came downstairs during dinner, sensing the tension like a change in barometric pressure. She sat quietly, pushing food around her plate. Dad, she said suddenly, why don't your cards work? The question hung there, innocent and devastating. Daniel looked at me, panic flashing across his face. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because, I said gently before he could deflect. Sometimes when people say hurtful things, there are consequences they didn't expect. Lucy frowned. Like when I lose screen time? Yes, I said. Like that. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to eating. Daniel didn't say a word. Later, after Lucy went to bed, he exploded. Not violently, verbally. Accusations. Justifications. Rationalizations. He framed himself as the victim of an overreaction, of my emotional instability. Old tactics, dusted off and redeployed. I let him talk. When he finally ran out of breath, I said, You called me replaceable. He scoffed. That again? Yes, I said. That forever. Something in my tone must have reached him, because his shoulders sagged slightly. I didn't think it mattered, he admitted. That's the problem, I replied. It mattered because I mattered. Silence followed. Not the heavy, suffocating kind from before, but something thinner, uncertain. The sound of a structure settling after a foundational shift. That night he slept in the guest room again. I lay awake, listening to the house breathe, thinking about how quickly power rearranges itself when assumptions fail. By morning, Daniel understood one thing with painful clarity. I was not reacting. I was correcting. The legal lines had been drawn long before Daniel ever crossed them. That was the part he couldn't wrap his mind around. The idea that consequences didn't spring from emotion, but from preparation. He kept insisting this was sudden, impulsive, vindictive. He couldn't see that it was procedural. Years earlier, when Lucy was still small and Daniel was riding a streak of professional success that made him reckless, I'd watched a colleague unravel after a divorce that turned ugly fast. Accounts drained. Assets hidden. Custody weaponized. I'd gone home that night and reread our prenuptial agreement with a pen in my hand. Daniel had signed it in a hurry, distracted by a phone call, trusting me to handle the boring stuff. I had handled it. I'd insisted on provisions that acknowledged financial management as contribution, clauses that allowed protective pauses during marital disputes, language that treated stability as an asset, not a footnote. He'd laughed about it afterward. You're planning our divorce already? No, I'd said. I'm planning for fairness. That word meant nothing to him then. Now it meant everything. When my attorney and I spoke again, she didn't ask whether I wanted to escalate. She asked how far I'd already gone. I told her the truth. She nodded on the other end of the line, unsurprised. You followed the agreement, she said. That matters. What followed wasn't dramatic. No threats. No emergency filings. Just documentation. Formal notices drafted but not sent. Boundaries clarified. Options mapped. I wasn't burning bridges. I was installing guardrails. Daniel tried to regain control by invoking authority he no longer fully possessed. He mentioned lawyers. He mentioned his money. He mentioned how this would look. Each attempt landed weaker than the last. "This will get ugly," he warned me one evening, voice low. "It doesn't have to," I replied. "But it will be honest." Honesty frightened him more than conflict ever had. The freeze remained in place, not as punishment but as leverage. Leverage he'd never imagined I held. He started asking before spending. Started checking in. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Respect, it turns out, often follows consequence. Lucy noticed too. She watched him more carefully now, and she watched me with something like pride. I didn't say that out loud. I didn't need to. One night, as I tucked her in, she asked, "Are you and Dad getting divorced?" I sat on the edge of her bed, choosing my words with care. "I don't know yet," I said. "But whatever happens, you'll be okay. And you'll never be asked to shrink for someone else's comfort." She nodded, eyes serious. "Good." In the quiet that followed, I understood something with painful clarity. The legal protections weren't just about assets or access. They were about modeling boundaries. About showing my daughter that foresight isn't pessimism, and self-respect isn't cruelty. Daniel had called me replaceable because he'd mistaken my restraint for weakness. The law didn't make that mistake. Neither did I. By the end of that week, the lines were clear. Not crossed. Not blurred. Clear. And for the first time in years, I felt something like equilibrium return. Lucy asked the question on a Thursday night, standing barefoot in the hallway, her hair still damp from the shower. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. That was what scared me. She was calm in the way people get when they've already put pieces together and just need confirmation. "Mom," she said, leaning against the doorframe, "is Dad in trouble because of me?" The words hit me harder than anything Daniel had said all week. "No," I said immediately, crossing the hallway in 2 steps. "No. Absolutely not." She searched my face, looking for cracks, for hesitation. Finding none, she let out a breath she'd been holding too long. "Then why does he look like that?" she asked. "Like someone took something away from him." I sat down on the floor with my back against the wall and patted the space beside me. She sat, knees drawn to her chest, suddenly 13 in a way that felt much older. "Do you remember when you were little?" I began. "And you'd grab something fragile without realizing how tightly you were holding it?" She nodded. "And it would break." "Yes," I said softly. "Not because you meant to hurt it, but because you didn't notice how much pressure you were using." She thought about that. "Dad has been holding things too tightly," I continued. "Control. Certainty. People." Her eyes widened slightly. "Including you?" "Especially me," I said. And when he said something that showed he didn't understand how much that hurt, I stopped letting him hold things the same way. Lucy was quiet for a long time. "Is that why his money doesn't work?" she asked. "Yes. Forever." I shook my head. "No. Just long enough for him to understand." She considered this with the seriousness of a judge. "So you didn't do it to be mean?" "No," I said. "I did it to be safe." That distinction seemed to settle into her. She leaned her head against my shoulder, something she hadn't done in months. "I'm glad you didn't let him say that," she murmured. "Say what?" "That you're replaceable," she said. "Because if you are, then I am too." The logic was devastating in its simplicity. I wrapped my arm around her, holding her the way I had when she was small and nightmares came in waves. "You are not replaceable," I said firmly. "And neither am I. And anyone who makes you feel that way is wrong." She nodded, eyes glossy but steady. "Okay." When she went to bed, I stayed sitting on the floor long after the hallway went quiet. That was the moment it crystallized for me. Not the dinner, not the frozen accounts, not even Daniel's unraveling. This was the line. This was the reason. Daniel's actions hadn't just diminished me. They'd threatened to teach our daughter that love requires erasure. That safety comes from being useful, not valued. I wouldn't let that lesson root itself in her bones. Later that night, Daniel tried one last time to reframe everything as a misunderstanding. He used words like intent and context and stress. I listened until he finished. Then I said, Lucy knows. He went very still. She asked why your cards don't work. I continued. And I told her the truth. Not details. Just consequences. You involved her, he snapped. No, I said calmly. You did. The moment you spoke. Like that in front of her. His anger collapsed into something smaller, meaner. You're turning her against me. I shook my head. I'm teaching her to listen. That ended the conversation. When I went to bed, I didn't feel victorious. I felt heavy but grounded, anchored to something that mattered more than being right or winning or preserving appearances. I had chosen the harder truth over the easier silence. And my daughter had understood exactly why. Daniel's rage didn't come all at once. It arrived in waves, each one weaker than the last, eroding rather than crashing. That was how I knew something fundamental had shifted. Rage thrives on leverage. When leverage disappears, it has nowhere to anchor. The first wave was loud. Accusations hurled like blunt instruments. He told me I was manipulative, vindictive, unstable. He said I was rewriting history, that I was punishing him for being honest. His voice rose, then cracked, then rose again, searching for the pitch that used to make me fold. I didn't. I sat at the dining table, the same one where the word replaceable had been spoken, and folded laundry while he talked. That detail mattered. I didn't posture. I didn't loom. I didn't cry. I continued with an ordinary task, signaling something he couldn't ignore. I was no longer orienting myself around his emotional weather. Say something, he demanded. I'm listening, I said. No, you're not, he snapped. You're judging. I looked up then, meeting his eyes. I judged when you spoke to me that way. I said evenly. This is me enforcing the conclusion. That was when his anger faltered, just for a moment. A flicker of disbelief crossed his face. Not because I'd said something cruel, but because I'd said something final. The second wave was quieter. Strategic. He tried to bargain. Let's just reset, he said one night, rubbing his temples. You unfreeze the accounts. We move on. I'll watch what I say. I shook my head. That's not accountability, I replied. That's damage control. He scoffed. You want me to grovel? No, I said. I want you to understand. He laughed bitterly. You think this makes you powerful? The question hung between us. I think this makes me equal, I said. That was the moment he understood he'd already lost the ground he was standing on. Power dynamics don't flip dramatically. They invert quietly, and by the time one person notices, it's already too late. The third wave was the smallest, and the most revealing. It came late at night, when defenses were tired and masks slipped. I didn't think you'd do anything, he admitted, voice low. You never did before. There it was. The truth stripped bare. I know, I said. He looked at me then, not with anger, not with contempt, but with something like grief. Grief for a version of me he'd relied on. The woman who absorbed, who smoothed, who stayed predictable. I didn't think you could, he said. I always could, I replied. I just didn't want to. After that, his rage evaporated. What remained was unease. Uncertainty. He began moving through the house. Carefully, as if unsure which rules still applied. He asked before speaking, before spending, before assuming. Lucy noticed. She watched him the way she watched new teachers, polite, observant, no longer instinctively trusting. That was a loss Daniel would feel long after the accounts unfroze. And through it all, my calm never wavered. Not because I was unhurt, but because I was done explaining myself to someone who had mistaken access for entitlement. There is a particular stillness that comes after you reclaim yourself. It's not peace, not yet. It's composure earned the hard way. The kind that unnerves people who benefited from your silence. Daniel felt that. I could see it in the way he avoided my eyes. In the way his voice softened without being asked. In the way his certainty drained away, replaced by something closer to respect. Or at least caution. That was enough for now. The cost of calling someone replaceable doesn't announce itself all at once. It ripples outward, touching places you didn't even know were connected. Daniel learned that slowly, painfully, as the consequences of his certainty reached beyond our kitchen and into the world he cared so deeply about. It started with questions he couldn't answer easily. A colleague called casual at first. "Hey, everything okay? Your assistant said there was some issue with travel approvals." Daniel laughed it off, blamed a banking glitch. But glitches don't repeat themselves. And they don't make people hesitate before speaking. Then there were the invitations that softened. The dinners postponed. The subtle shift in tone when he mentioned upcoming deals. People rely on confidence the way ships rely on calm seas. When the waters get choppy, they look elsewhere. At home. The pressure from his family arrived next. His sister called me one afternoon, voice tight with concern disguised as civility. "He's under a lot of stress," she said. "You don't need to make this harder." I held the phone away from my ear for a moment, breathing. "I didn't create the stress," I replied. "I responded to it." There was a pause. Then quieter. "He says you're overreacting." I smiled without warmth. He would. The narrative he tried to build, that I was unstable, punitive, emotional, never quite stuck. Because I hadn't behaved that way. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't threatened. I'd acted within frameworks he'd agreed to. Calm unnerves people more than fury ever does. Socially, the shift was unmistakable. At a school event, a mutual acquaintance pulled me aside. "Are you okay?" she asked gently, glancing toward Daniel, who stood a few feet away, unusually subdued. "Yes," I said. And for the first time it wasn't a lie. Daniel, meanwhile, shrank in ways that surprised him. He spoke less at dinner. He deferred where he once dictated. When he did try to reassert himself, it landed awkwardly, like a man repeating lines from a play that no longer fit the stage. One night, after Lucy had gone to bed, he said quietly, "People are treating me differently." I looked at him. "How?" "Like I'm not in control." I chose my words carefully. "Control isn't the same as respect," I said. "And respect isn't guaranteed." He swallowed. The truth of that settled heavily between us. The irony was sharp. By calling me replaceable, he'd exposed his own fragility. His authority had depended on my invisibility. Once that vanished, so did the illusion of his independence. Lucy watched all of this with a perceptiveness that both worried and reassured me. She asked fewer questions now. She observed. She noted who apologized, who adjusted, who doubled down. She was learning, whether we liked it or not. One evening, she said, "Dad doesn't talk the same anymore." "No," I agreed. "He's listening." "Is that good?" "It's necessary," I said. The public consequences continued quietly. Daniel's confidence never quite recovered. Its old shine. Not because he'd lost money. Those accounts would eventually be unfrozen. But because he'd lost something harder to reclaim. Unquestioned authority. At home, the atmosphere shifted from tension to something like cautious neutrality. We existed in parallel, careful not to collide. The future remained uncertain. But one thing was clear. The cost of his words had exceeded his expectations. And mine. Calling someone replaceable doesn't make them disappear. Sometimes, it makes them step fully into view. Learning to breathe without him took longer than I expected. Not because I missed the man he'd become, but because I had to unlearn the reflex of accounting for him in every decision. Independence isn't a switch you flip. It's a muscle you rebuild slowly. After years of compensating for someone else's weight. The house felt different as weeks passed. Quieter. Not in a lonely way, but in a way that left space where noise used to be. I began noticing my own thoughts again. Complete sentences uninterrupted by his corrections or dismissals. I lingered over choices instead of preemptively compromising. I took longer walks. I rearranged the living room. Furniture, something he'd always had opinions about. I changed small things first. Lamps. Routines. The coffee I bought. Each choice was a reminder. I didn't need permission. Daniel noticed. Of course. He always did when the ground shifted beneath him. "You're changing things," he said one evening, not accusing, just wary. "Yes," I replied. He nodded as if filing that away. He'd started filing things away now, the way I always had. Emotionally, the work was harder. Anger had burned off quickly. What remained was grief, not for the marriage as it was, but for the version of myself I'd abandoned to maintain it. I mourned her quietly, during commutes and showers, in the spaces where no one expected strength from me. Lucy adapted faster than either of us. Children are resilient when they're not forced to pretend. She relaxed into a version of herself that asked questions freely, that disagreed without fear of reprisal. She laughed more easily. That alone told me everything I needed to know. One afternoon, as we sat on the couch doing nothing in particular, she said, "You seem lighter." I smiled. "I am. Is it because you don't have to explain yourself all the time?" The insight stunned me. "Yes," I said. "Exactly." She nodded, satisfied, and leaned against me. Daniel and I began talking, not about reconciliation, not about blame, but about logistics, practicalities. The tone was different now, careful, measured. He no longer assumed compliance. He asked, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes sincerely. The accounts remained partially restricted, a reminder rather than a weapon. Trust doesn't regenerate on a schedule. It grows when conditions change. I returned to parts of myself I'd neglected. I enrolled in a class I'd postponed for years. I reconnected with friends I'd quietly drifted from. I let myself imagine a future that wasn't organized around mitigating someone else's volatility. That imagining was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. One night, lying alone in bed, I realized something profound. The fear that had kept me accommodating for so long wasn't fear of being alone. It was fear of being seen clearly and rejected. When Daniel called me replaceable, he'd confirmed that fear, and in doing so, robbed it of its power. You can't threaten someone with what they've already survived. By the end of that month, I could breathe deeply again. Fully. The kind of breath that reaches your spine. The kind that reminds you your body belongs to you. Whatever came next, together or apart, I knew one thing with certainty. I would never make myself smaller to keep someone else comfortable again. What I would tell any woman listening now is this. The moment someone calls you replaceable, believe them. Not because it's true, but because it reveals how they see you. Words like that don't slip out by accident. They surface when respect has already eroded and entitlement has taken its place. Daniel and I didn't resolve everything neatly. Life rarely offers that courtesy. Some mornings, we could speak calmly about schedules and responsibilities. Other days, the air between us felt brittle, like glass under tension. But the dynamic had changed permanently. He no longer assumed my presence was guaranteed, and I no longer behaved as if it were. The accounts were eventually unfrozen in stages, tied to agreements, conversations, observable change. Not promises. Not apologies. Spoken to late at night. Change you could measure. That mattered to me. It still does. Lucy watched the process unfold with a seriousness that made me ache and swell with pride at the same time. She learned that love is not proven by endurance alone. That respect is not something you earn by shrinking. That boundaries don't mean you love less. They mean you love with clarity. One evening, weeks later, she asked, "Would you do it again?" I didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Yes," I said, without hesitation. She nodded. Good. Daniel never apologized the way people imagine apologies should sound. There was no grand speech, no tearful reckoning. What there was instead was restraint, awareness, a carefulness that hadn't existed before. Sometimes that's the most honest form of remorse a person can manage. And maybe that was enough. Or maybe it wasn't. I'm still living inside that answer. What I know for certain is this. I didn't freeze his accounts to punish him. I froze them to stop myself from disappearing. To interrupt a pattern that had taught my daughter the wrong lessons. To remind myself that preparation is not pessimism. It's self-respect made practical. Calling someone replaceable is a test. Not of their worth, but of their tolerance. I failed that test deliberately. And in failing it, I passed another, one I didn't even know I'd been studying for my entire life. If you're listening to this and something in your chest feels tight, pay attention. That feeling isn't weakness. It's information. And information, once acknowledged, changes everything. So I'll leave you with this. What would happen if the next time someone diminished you, you didn't explain, didn't plead, didn't endure, but simply adjusted the system around you? And who might you become if you stopped mistaking silence for peace? Looking back now, what stays with me isn't the shock of the word replaceable, or even the chaos that followed. It's the clarity it forced into my life. Pain has a way of stripping away the stories we tell ourselves to survive, leaving only what's real underneath. And what was real for me was this. I had built an entire life around making myself easy to keep. The lesson wasn't about money, or marriage, or even revenge. It was about systems, emotional, financial, relational, and who they're designed to serve. For years, the system of my marriage served stability at the cost of self-respect. The moment I refused that trade, everything shifted. I learned that strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like paperwork, like restraint, like saying no without raising your voice. And I learned that children don't need perfect parents, they need honest ones. Ones who show them that love and dignity can exist together. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. You don't have to explode to change your life. You don't have to scream to be heard. You just have to stop participating in systems that erase you. So ask yourself, quietly, truthfully, where have you been making yourself smaller to keep someone else comfortable? And what would happen if you stopped?